Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is part 4 of What If Ash Caught Latias. Now if you remember yesterday, after part 3, the Battle Frontier, a poll went live on the community tab. And it asked you 2 separate questions. The first one is, should Ash continue as a Frontier Brain? Or should Ash go to Sinnoh? If you're watching this one on YouTube, that means that you guys chose for Ash to go to Sinnoh with Latias. But if you're watching this one on Patreon, that means that you get exclusive access for the time being to this video. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, there's a couple of things that we're going to have to establish here. Ash is going to choose not to become a Frontier Brain. And with that, he chooses to go back to Oak's lab, where he inevitably meets up with his old rival Gary. And here, he flaunts his Battle Frontier victory and ends up battling with Pikachu against Gary's newest Pokemon, Electivire, where it inevitably loses. And this convinces Ash to go out to the Sinnoh region for some new adventures. Now there's a couple of things here that's going to have to change. In this timeline, Ash didn't catch Apom, which means he's not going to have to worry about it chasing after him. So we're going to say for the time being that Latias headed back to Altamare after Ash's battle with Brandon at the Battle Pyramid. So with that being said, after his battle with Gary, he chooses to leave all of his Pokemon back at Oak's lab, which means he's heading into the Sinnoh region with just Pikachu, and he doesn't have to worry about Apom tagging along. Now, things from here are still going to play out pretty much the same. Ash is going to end up getting separated from Pikachu to where he has to go hunting down. Now, without Apom around, this is going to prove to be a little bit more difficult. But there's one thing that's going to happen here that's going to end up changing how things play out. You see in the original, Ash ended up catching a Starly because it got in a fight with Apom over some food. But because Ash doesn't really have Apom here, there's no fight to ensue. So he eventually just goes throughout everything looking for Pikachu. Which means that this is going to affect his journey really significantly. Because that means that he doesn't meet Paul right off the bat anyway. And not only that, but it takes him a little while longer to get caught up with Dawn and Pikachu. Which means this is going to lead to Ash not actually having a battle with Paul, because the only thing he has is Pikachu. Which is interesting, because heading to the Sinnoh region, before Ash had even reached his first badge, he had 4 Pokemon. Now, we're 3 episodes in, and Ash only has 1. But that's going to quickly change, because we're going to get the first Pokemon that Ash is going to encounter here, Turtwig. Yes, I'm going to allow Turtwig to be on the team in this one, just because I thought it would be fun. But that will only bring Ash's Pokemon roster to 2, which is odd. Anyway, this is where we'll end up having the battle with Ash and Paul. This, however, will be the first battle, and it'll end up being a one-on-one. Turtwig versus Chimchar. The battle will still go the same though, and Chimchar will end up taking the victory. Unfortunately, Turtwig, it's tough, but it's got the type of disadvantage. And Paul's method of training, well, it's kind of severe. Now, the problem that we're going to face here is that Paul didn't really get a chance to experience Ash and his unique battle style, which means that, this is just a regular match for both of them. And even though Ash doesn't like the fact that Paul is the way he is with his Pokemon, he's just going to move on. It's not really going to be significant. So with that being said, Ash will end up moving on to the first gym. Now, because Ash doesn't have his other Pokemon with him, we're going to have to make a couple of stops, a couple of detours. So my thought is, Ash is going to have to get some new Mons because he only has 2. And the fact that he doesn't have Apom means that he's not going to be able to trade with Dawn in order to get Buizel. So that's going to leave a lot of drastic changes in his team. And with the shortage of roster members, I feel like that Turtwig would get a lot more time to battle. And because it's going to get a lot more time to battle, I think that would end up forcing its evolution before the first gym. So really quickly, Ash would find himself with the Grottle. But that still doesn't solve the problem of Ash needing a new Mon. I think we're going to give Ash a Burmy. Now, this Burmy is going to be male, and that's going to be for a very specific reason. Now, Ash hasn't really had a bug type in a couple of generations, not since Heracross. So I feel like this fits. And this is something that can easily be caught around the journey of the Sinnoh region before he gets to his first gym badge. So nothing really has to change too much as far as going out of his way to get it. But I do like the aspect of him potentially having a new bug type that he's never really had much interaction before. Now with us bringing his roster to 3, I feel like we should still kind of follow suit to the anime and give him a 4th Pokemon before he gets to the gym. And I kind of want to follow the same logic of giving him a normal type like he had with Apom. So we're going to say that right before Ash gets to the first gym, he's going to encounter one of Jessie's older Pokemon that she hasn't seen in a long time, Lickitung. Now, this isn't the one that Jessie caught, but her and Ash would have an interaction, and she would have some flashbacks, and it would kind of create a rivalry between her and Ash because she wanted to catch this Pokemon. But with Ash's new Grottle, he's able to easily overpower Jessie and her Viper and catch Lickitung for himself, bringing his roster to 4. Now you see, this is going to change things a little bit more because Ash is going to arrive at the first gym in Oreburgh City a little bit later than Paul did, so they're not going to really have any interaction here, which means Ash isn't going to see Chimchar, which is unfortunate. But you know what? We can't really change that now because he's had a couple of side adventures that really didn't happen, which delayed his time a little bit. However, this is going to change one thing in his battle with Rorik. He's not going to try to be something he's not, like he was in the original battle, trying to prove Paul wrong by doing things Paul's way and confusing himself and his Pokemon, which in the end I think is going to allow Ash to end up taking the win here. Now I think Lickitung would just replace Ambipom in the battle, and then Pikachu would still fill its normal role. Now at this point I think Grotto would end up coming in to battle Cranidos instead of Rampardos, and the reason I say that is because timeline's a little bit off here, and Team Rocket wasn't there exactly when the whole events of the Aerodactyl being resurrected was to happen, which means that the caveat that Rampardos used to evolve wouldn't have happened. So Rorik would still have a Cranidos, which means that it would be Cranidos versus Grotto. And because of its high defense and Ash not really trying to rely on its speed, but more of its stubborn style of battling, it would allow it to withstand a lot of the damage and would eventually overpower Cranidos, giving Ash his first badge of the Sinnoh region. Now with that being said, we're moving on to Eternal Forest. I think here we can actually see the next evolution in Ash's team being Burmy. Burmy evolving into Mothim would actually be kind of unique for Ash's team because it's been a long time since he's had a bug flying type. And not only that, but we're going to make this a main center point of his team. It's going to be his flyer for the region because he missed Starly. But not only that, but it's going to allow Ash to interact with the typing that he really doesn't have too much familiarity with. So with that, after the evolution that happens in Eternal Forest, we're going to move on to Eternal City, where Ash will end up meeting Gardenia and challenging her for her badge at the second gym of the Sinnoh region. This battle will obviously have to play out differently because Ash doesn't have Apom or Staravia. Here, I think he would go with Lickitung, and he's also going to go with Mothim. But the battle would still play out the same, except for the fact that it would be Mothim that ends up battling Roserade. Now Ash's Mothim has access to some moves that give it an advantage against Roserade, being Gust and Psybeam, which would be a big help in closing out the battle here, giving Ash his second badge. Now we are going to have to move on to one very important key factor, the Hearthome tag battle. You see, because Ash is a little bit behind here, he's actually going to arrive just at the end of the Hearthome tag battle, which means, well, he's not going to get Chimchar. They're too far off of the journey, and the events that led up to Paul releasing Chimchar and Ash being there for it, they haven't happened. Which means in this version of events, Ash won't have his fire starter, his ace of the region, which is going to allow us to focus on the one that they originally hinted at, Grottle. But anyway, with that being said, we're going to move on here. We are now heading out of Hearthome City because Fantina is not there. So we're going to move on to the site of our third badge, and that being Veilstone City. But before we get there, we're going to have to give Ash a couple of more Pokemon. This was actually quite interesting because now we're in completely uncharted territory with Ash, and he doesn't really have the same team that he had with going into the Sinnoh region. and it's deviated far from the original canon. So I wanted to have a little fun with this, and I think I may have come up with a solution to some of this problem. I think it would be great if Ash and Brock both had a Croagunk. Brock's Croagunk kind of just hanging out, doing its thing, you know, correcting Brock whenever he gets 2 over bearing on a Nurse Joy or Officer Jenny. And then Ash's Croagunk, who is very timid. It doesn't really have the confidence. And this would allow Ash to have a Pokemon to work with this generation. Kind of like he did with Chimchar, but without the abuse that it faced and the scars on its psyche. This would bring Ash's roster to 5 Mons. But I still think that there's one more Pokemon that we need to give Ash. And I think we'll find that as we're entering Veilstone City, because we're gonna meet up with someone's brother that usually is a key figure in the storyline. Reggie, a Pokemon breeder. But here, because Ash doesn't really have the rivalry for Paul, they're just kind of acquaintances more than friends. But Reggie is a Pokemon breeder, and he ends up giving Ash an egg. An egg that'll be very important later on. But with that being said, we're going to move on to the 3rd gym battle. This one is going to change drastically, because Maylene has now gone to the point to where she's, clinically depressed because of her loss to Paul. And Ash doesn't really know Paul that well, so he's still trying to figure things out. But Dawn does her thing and helps Maylene get back to working order and allows Ash to get his gym badge. So in this gym battle, what would Ash use? Well, I think here it would obviously have to be Mothim because of its flying type and its ability to use psychic type moves. I think also we would give a crack to Croagunk, his newest team member. And then lastly, I think Grottle would fill the final spot. And Grottle would end up being the Pokemon that Ash ends up using here the most. And it would eventually be the Pokemon that gets Ash the win against Lucario, but not before taking a heavy beating and activating its Overgrow ability, and learning a new move in Curse, allowing it to play the long game, increasing its attack and defense over time, so that way it can just one-shot Lucario with a high-impact move like Razor Leaf or Tackle, allowing Ash to secure his 3rd badge of the Sinnoh region. Now, this is where things are going to get kind of interesting, because Ash now has to travel to the 4th gym in the Sinnoh region. But on the way there, his egg is going to hatch. And I figured I would give you guys some fan service here, because a lot of you have been requesting this for a long time. The egg, it's going to be an Eevee. That's right, we're going to give Ash an Eevee in this one. And because it just hatched from an egg, Eevee is very playful. It's very baby-like, and it doesn't like to go in the ball right away. So Ash is going to have to work with it on that. And unfortunately, this is going to delay the growth of Eevee just a little bit, but it will eventually come around. But anyway, we're going to move on to the 4th gym of this region, the gym in Pastoria City, in Crasher Wake. Now, Crasher Wake is a very interesting individual. He's unique because he's a wrestler and he's got that big persona. Now, here, a lot of things are going to have to change, because Ash doesn't have Turtwig, he has Grottle, and he doesn't have Weasel. So things are going to be a little bit different. But I think that's okay, because in this battle, we would end up seeing Pikachu take out Gyarados like it did in the canon. And then in the 2nd battle, instead of sending Turtwig against Quagsire, he would end up using Grottle. And this would basically play out the same, except instead of using speed, Grottle would just use defense and slowly but surely overpower Quagsire and lock it into victory with a Razor Leaf, which is ×4 effective, so it's perfectly believable. That would bring the battle to the final point to where we would see Floatzel. Now, at this point, Ash would still have a full roster of 3, and he doesn't have Weasel, so we're going to have to figure something else out, but I think this is where we could get the chance to see Croagunk shine for the first time. And this is where we're going to discover Croagunk's unique ability, Dry Skin. Whenever it's hit with a water type attack, it just increases its HP instead. And in the end, Ash would end up taking this badge very similar to the style that he took it in the original, with 3 Pokemon still left, proving that Crasher Wake is the weakest gym leader of Sinnoh. But anyway, with that being said, now we're going to move on, and this is where Ash is going to end up having his mock battle with Fantina, where he ends up losing pretty one-sidedly, and Pikachu and Eevee and Croagunk all get one-shotted, which sucks, but it's going to prove to Ash that he has a lot of work to do. So with that being said, I think that we would get to move on from here, and all the things with Dawn still happens the same, to where she has to go to her contest, but that would then lead back into the battle with Fantine, and this is where we would get to meet Barry for the first time. So this is the first time we're actually establishing a rival for Ash, and Barry is just, Barry. Nothing really has to change here, but the main thing is Ash is going to get to have a battle with Fantina. And this battle is going to have to change pretty drastically because he's missing 2 members of the original team that he had. But that's okay though, because Ash is going to use some of the strategy he's been brewing up, because even though he doesn't have the original Mons, he still has the ability to do the counter shield technique. And honestly, I think that Pikachu could still learn it. I also think that Mothim could learn it, and the reason for it is because it could kind of use Psybeam like a counter shield type-esque deal, so I think that he would still have that whole thing there. And then the last member I think could use a counter shield-esque type deal would be Croagunk, and Croagunk could use it by using a move maybe like Sludge Bomb to create that barrier to ward off moves. So that's the team that Ash is going to use going into this battle. And I think in the end, we would actually end up giving this one to Croagunk, because I feel like Croagunk needs a win here. And not only that, but Croagunk it's one of my more offhand favorite mons. I really liked it in the anime when Brock had it, and I don't feel like it or its evolution has gotten enough love. But with that being said, that's going to lock in Ash's 5th gym badge of the Sinnoh region, and we get to move on to the 6th badge, which we get to tag along with Barry a little bit more. But that's okay, because we're going to end up in Cantilever City and Byron, and this ends up being a 3-on-3. Byron being a steel type user, I think it's pretty hilarious. But before we get there, Ash has a little bit of a training montage with Barry, where we see an evolution in his team. You see, Lickitung is going to learn Rollout, which is going to allow it to take on its next form, Licky Licky. The name is always funny when I say it. But anyway, this is going to lead us into our gym battle. And this is where Ash discovers that Byron and Rorik are father and son. That doesn't really change here, but what will change is Ash's roster, because now he's, missing everything that he used in this gym battle. So we're going to have to make a few changes. So first up, how about we go with Grottle? Grottle's been very good as of late, and it's proven to be quite the battler. And it's able to prove that it's a lot more stubborn than Bronzor, and it easily clinches the win, even though it does take some damage. So next out is going to end up being Steelix, and Steelix ends up proving that its massive size is too much for the grass turtle to handle, and it ends up getting leveled by an Iron Tail. But that's okay though. This is where Ash gets to send in his next Pokemon, Croagunk. And Croagunk is half poison, being at a slight disadvantage, but that's okay though, because it uses its fighting type ability to its advantage and is easily able to crack a Steelix over the head with the Brick Break, ending that battle and forcing Byron to send out his next Pokemon and his final ace, Bastiodon. This ends up being a battle of defense versus attack. In the end, Byron's Stubborn Streak and Bastion's overwhelming defense ends up overpowering Croagunk, knocking it out. This leaves us to the final match with Ash's newest Pokemon, Licky Licky. Now, Licky Licky here would prove to have a little bit of trouble, but it does have a decent stat base, and in the end, would end up being able to clinch things out with a move that it's learned since its evolution, Focus Punch. So that would give Ash his 6th badge of the Sinnoh region. Now here's where we're going to introduce Latias back into things, because the events of Team Galactic are starting to unfold, and Ash and his friends end up getting in the same position they do, where they're trying to rescue the Lake Trio. Unfortunately for Cyrus and friends, Latias is linked to Ash psychically, which means it's not going to stand by and let its trainer be put in danger. So it's going to make an appearance in the actual battle, and this would essentially just hurry things along. Latias' overwhelming power, because of the amount of training that it's had, plus being a legendary, it would force Team Galactic into a retreat, and Cyrus would still end up getting sucked into his universe, which means that Ash would be able to move on pretty freely. Now the choice do we have to make? Do we allow Latias to rejoin the team, Or do we let it go back to Altamira? I think at this point, it's okay for Latias to go back to Altamira. And the reason for it is because it can come at any point. We're past the point of it wanting to bond with Ash and being a continuous traveling companion. So Ash can call on it whenever he needs it. And whenever he's in trouble, he would do so. With that being said, we would now move on to the site of our 7th badge. But before we get to that, we have a stop to make, off into the wilds of the northern part of Sinnoh. And this is where Ash is going to see his next evolution, when Eevee comes in contact with a strange ice-covered rock and glows to become Glaceon. So now Ash has a Glaceon on his team. To me, that's pretty cool. I never actually used Glaceon in any type of battling in the games. I was always more of a Leafeon guy. So I figured, you know what, let's just give him an ice type here. And, you know what, give him an evolution that most people may not see him with. But anyway, we're going to move on to the 7th gym in Candace of Snow Point City. Now this girl, she's interesting. This battle ends up being a 4-on-4. And we get to see how things are going to change because Ash only has one of the Pokemon that he used in this battle, being Grottle. Now things are going to play out very interesting. The battle would still start with Grottle doing his thing, where he would end up facing Sneasel and end up winning. Then Medicham would get sent out, and instead of Ash wanting to keep Grottle in, he would recall it for later, sending in Mothim to battle the fighting type. This would prompt Candace to comment on how Ash is doing things that she would expect people to do, but in the end, Mothim and Medicham would end up getting a double knockout. This would then prompt Candace to send in her 3rd Pokemon, which would be Snover. At this point, Ash would send in Croagunk, and those two would battle it out. Croagunk would eventually get the win because of the fighting type, forcing Candace to send out her last Pokemon, Abomasnow. Now, Abomasnow will make quick work of our resident frog, so that would force Ash to send in his next Pokemon, which he would try Glaceon here. Now, Glaceon being relatively new to the ice typing, it hasn't gotten used to its new body yet. So even though it does have the type neutrality against Abomasnow, unfortunately, Abomasnow's experience is just going to be able to outlast it here. This is going to leave Ash with just one Pokemon, and that is going to be Grottle. Ash sends back in his turtle, and this battle gets pretty hard because Grottle is at a pure disadvantage when it comes to battling Abomasnow. But this is where we're going to trigger Grottle's evolution into Torterra, and this is what gives Torterra the power it needs to eventually overpower Abomasnow and take it down, earning Ash his 7th badge of the Sinnoh region. Now, with that being said, we have to move on to the final gym badge in Sunnyshoar City. Ash arrives and things play out as normal. You see, they don't really have any interaction with Paul, which means they get to skip the battle at a Lake Acuity, which does affect things because Ash doesn't have the motivation that he had before. And he also gets to encounter Barry, who's like, oh yeah, the gym is great, I got a free badge. Ash, of course, isn't going to want a free badge because he's already had that happen to him in the past. So he's going to do whatever he can to convince Wagner to battle him, which ends up leading to a battle with Flint, to where he has to end up battling. And, you know, because he doesn't have Infernape and he doesn't have Weasel here, things are going to be a little bit different. But still, Ash, no matter what he chooses on his team, is not going to be able to beat Flint's Infernape. However, Pikachu's last stand, we would say, ends up being the defining factor in allowing Ash to convince Wagner to battle. Now, he still requests the time for them to train, which he does, and it's during this point that I would say that we would finally get the evolution of Croagunk into Toxicroak, giving Ash a fully evolved team. And even though it's not the same team he had in canon, I do think that this team is kind of impressive. I mean, it's not something that I would have ever thought to have played through, but after thinking what we could do differently in this What If, I really wanted to bring team members that he realistically probably never would have had. So I wanted to have a little bit more fun with this. But there's one thing we have to address. At this point, is Ash going to get Gibble? Well, I think he could still get Gibble, because it really doesn't take anything away from the storyline. Ash ends up catching it after he lets Gliscor go on with the Air Battle Master. So here, I would say, instead of Gliscor doing that, we'll just say that Mothim does it, so that way it opens up a party on his roster. But that's okay, because Gibble's still going to go through the same stuff it does trying to master Draco Meteor. It's not going to have any overbearing change on the story as it has with everything else. So things will still play out the same, and Ash would end up going back to face Faulkner. Now, the battle itself is going to change a little bit because he doesn't have Infernape. So I still think that it would end up being Pikachu versus Electivire, and that would kind of still play out the same. The only difference is he doesn't use Torterra right off the bat. Then Faulkner would end up sending in his Jolteon. This I could see Ash using Glaceon against, wanting to test Evolution against Evolution. In the end, Glaceon is able just enough to withstand some of the attacks to overpower Jolteon, getting Ash to the final battle against Luxray. Unfortunately, Luxray is able to overpower both Glaceon and Pikachu, ending their run. This is going to force Ash to send in Torterra. Now, we're going to make Torterra the star here because we didn't really get that in the original anime, which means let's give it some love. And Torterra is going to prove it's got what it takes by activating Overgrow and just completely decimating Luxray with a Leaf Storm. That is going to give Ash his 8th badge of the Sinnoh region and allow him to move on to the main Sinnoh competition. Now, with that being said, we get a montage of Ash bringing back his old Pokemon and everything he had caught up to this point, and he's got to go through some battles. The first one being Nando. Now, nothing in Nando really has to change. We'll still get the same battles that play out and everything like that. Then there's the battle with Conway. Now, Conway is going to have to change slightly because Ash doesn't have Noctowl. So we could just ruin his entire day and throw Latias there. And honestly, I think Latias would be too overpowering for Conway to really stand up to anything. But in the end, we'll just say he recalled Latias and used Gibble, and it still won the same way it did with Shuckle. Then we're going to have to move on through the main events because Ash pretty much just blew through the preliminaries. And this is where Ash is going to actually get his first true battle with Paul. A 6-on-6 against this trainer that he's only battled once. A trainer that he doesn't know that well. And Paul, being the strategist that he is, well, he's going to know pretty much everything about Ash. He's going to have access to anything and everything that he's been able to capture. So he's going to set up his team accordingly. Ash being Ash, he's probably going to end up using his entire Sinnoh roster here, minus Gibble. He's probably going to keep that off, which that's okay, because in the end, that's what he did in the original anime. I don't see Paul's team actually changing here, because it still poses a pretty good threat to everything else on Ash's team. Now, the battle will play out as follows. Paul would send in Aggron, and Ash, not really having too much that has an advantage over this, would end up sending in Toxicroak. Toxicroak would be able to one-shot it with a Brick Break, pretty much ending it like Infernape did in the original anime. But then we would see Gastrodon hit the field. Now, Gastrodon wouldn't have the ability of the Counter Shield like it did in the original anime, but it would still prove to be an avid battler and really, really tanky. And unfortunately, Ash wanting to keep in Toxicroak, this would end up costing him. And also, I feel like it would end up costing him Mothim as well. That would bring Ash with just 3 Pokemon, while Paul still has 5. Luckily for Ash though, once Licky Licky gets in, its defense is going to be enough to stand up to Gastrodon and knock it out. This is where we're going to see Drapion. Now, this is going to be interesting because Drapion was proven to be very defensive. The problem is, Licky Licky is kind of built to battle with Drapion, if you know what I mean. So I don't think that Drapion would be as imposing as in the original. And Ash would actually be able to end Drapion fairly quickly with Licky Licky. Unfortunately, it would come at a cost because now Licky Licky is extremely worn out. And at this point, Ash would end up recalling it, saving it for later. So that way, he can use somebody fresh. Unfortunately, he ends up sending Pikachu in here. And it gets hit with the Toxic Spikes because Ash didn't really know what they did. Which kind of sucks because Pikachu is probably one of the best choices he has. But regardless, the battle must go on. This is where Paul sends in his Frostlass. And unfortunately for Pikachu, Frostlass is very, very evasive. But Pikachu is able to edge out a win after it manages to land an Iron Tail consecutively twice back to back. One on the ground, blowing the hail and the haze away, and the other to hit Frostlass, ending the battle. Now, with that being said, this would leave Paul to send in his next Pokemon, Ninjask. and Ash would elect to keep Pikachu in because he doesn't want to risk another poison on any of his Pokemon. This in the beginning goes well for Ash, as he's able to overpower Ninjask with Thunderbolts, almost knocking it out. Unfortunately, it knows Giga Drain, and it's able to recover its HP by sapping what Pikachu has left, ending it in the battle. This leaves Ash with only 3 Pokemon himself. One of them is already battled, Licky Licky. Unfortunately, he has no other choice, and he sends in Glaceon here. Now, Glaceon does eventually get poisoned, because Ash doesn't have a fire type to deal with it like he did in the original anime. So unfortunately, it's going to be a reoccurring thing over this battle. But fortunately for Ash, Glaceon is able to eventually outpace the speed boost of Ninjask and land an Ice Beam, ending the battle, giving Ash the win. It's at this point that Ash has to make a choice, leaving Glaceon or send back in Licky Licky or his last Pokemon, Torterra. Now here, I think we would end up seeing Electivire, saving the one change that we're going to have for Paul's team to the end. And Electivire, unfortunately, just because of how it was built with Paul, it's able to make quick work of Glaceon, and it's able to make quick work of a very exhausted Licky Licky. This is going to leave one Pokemon left for Ash. The starter that he entered the region with, Torterra. Now he sends out Torterra, and it does fall victim to the poison spikes. But Torterra, being as stubborn as Ash, is able to overpower Electivire and take it out. This in the process causes enough damage for Overgrow to activate for the turtle. But this leads to Paul's final Pokemon. The Pokemon that he didn't have to release, and Ash ended up with. Infernape. Infernape in this timeline is a little bit more of a wild savage. Because of the training it underwent with Paul, it took more of an aggressive approach to things. It's not afraid. It gained confidence a lot quicker, and it developed sort of a mean streak. And not only that, but Paul, because of his emphasis on the training with Blaze, Infernape is able to activate this power a lot quicker than in the anime. And unfortunately for Ash, this is going to be where his Sinnoh journey ends, because Torterra is not going to be able to overpower Infernape, no matter how much training it's had. And there's one key factor here that's changed versus Ash's original run. Because he didn't have that rivalry with Paul, he wasn't as motivated. So even though his team did get built up and they all fully evolved and they were as strong as they possibly could be, they just weren't motivated to grow, which in the end affected them, allowing Paul to take the victory and moving on to the next round of the Sinnoh League. This is where Paul gets one-shotted by Tobias, just like Ash did in the original, ending the runs of both competitors. And that's it. That concludes Ash's journey through Sinnoh. With that being said, Ash would then head up back to Pallet Town for his next adventure. This will be the second to last part in this journey, because after this, I don't really think there's much more Ash can do, because he's actually already technically won a regional championship in Hoenn, and he made it to the Elite Four, even though he didn't get a chance to battle the champion. And with that being said, that's where we're going to leave this part today. So, how do you feel about Ash's Sinnoh adventures in this version of What If Ash Caught Latias? Now, don't get me wrong, I fully understand that there wasn't a lot of Latias in this one. Now, I feel that was because we're at the point where Ash and Latias would kind of go their separate ways for a little while. It would show up when it needed, help out in the league, but Ash would still do what he normally did. But with that being said, let me know what you thought about this part in the comments down below. How do you feel about Ash's team and what he used in the gym battles and the battle? How do you feel about Paul keeping Chimchar instead of releasing it, and Paul inevitably winning at the Sinnoh League, beating Ash in this version? Let me know. And also, don't forget to follow me on my other platforms, and if you want to help the channel grow a little bit more and you want to donate a little bit extra, follow me on Patreon. Only $5 a month will get you 1 week's early access to all of my content when it posts. But with all that being said, it's time to sign out the video the best way we know how, by thanking the Patreons. Silver Heart Soul, Robert, Vegito Gaming 78, Andrew McCartney, Holosiv, Julian Rodriguez, Ruben Watson, Lord Explosion Murder, Assassin 139, Flyer 943, Shadow Dragon, K McKnight, Kevin Atran, Drax, True Volt, Adrian Carr, Dino King, Dalen Silva, Fox King, Dalian Petit, Warney Taylor, Plus Ultraman, Megar, Mike Logan, Team Valor, Kendall Green, Earth Dragon, John Larson, John Van Meplin. Thank you all so much for your support, and I'll see you tomorrow.